Welcome to Pleasurology Island, my friends. I'm Free Thought Steve, the lone pleasurologist. Thanks for stopping by. I'd like to advise you that this is a serious educational program intended for mature audiences only. I'll be talking about sex, honestly and realistically. So, unless you're mature enough to be able to hear sex talked about honestly and realistically, you shouldn't watch this. I do not want to traumatize you with too much sexual realism. And I will be expressing some opinions about sexuality, some judgments about sexuality and other things, which are not the conventional opinions that you will hear in mainstream straight society. I consider myself a representative of the psychedelic counterculture and a social critic of the mainstream straight society, so I will be criticizing the sexual judgments of the mainstream society, sexual judgments which are basically sexual prejudices that have been passed down to us by previous generations. So we call them the received sexual ideas that we have received from previous generations, meaning we haven't thought them up ourselves, and most of the time we haven't thought them through for ourselves either. That we've just had them indoctrinated into us, like when my father indoctrinated me when I was 12 years old to believe that masturbation was a sin, that lust was a sin, that I shouldn't feel sexual feelings like that, even though he himself, the big hypocrite, was a lifelong compulsive masturbator. So I don't know why he thought it would be any easier for me once I had learned the pleasure of orgasm, which I did at the age of 11 3/4. Once my brain had learned that, and had learned it in a very innocent way, with no feeling of guilt whatsoever, I had no idea that having orgasms had anything to do with sexual reproduction. I didn't know what sexual reproduction was at that age. No one had ever talked to me about it. Back in 1960, that was the sort of thing that people didn't talk about around children. So children grew up in complete sexual ignorance, which, I mean, has its good points and bad points. I grew up probably in more sexual ignorance than most children, so I didn't have any feelings of guilt whatsoever when I started to be able to give myself orgasms. And I could have gone on for years, I suppose, if I'd been insulated from the received ideas of our society, if I hadn't heard the ideas, the universal condemnation of masturbation that existed in the 1960s. I could have gone on for years, for the rest of my life, masturbating happily and guilt-free and just really enjoying the heck out of it. But my father went and ruined all that. So then, after several years of totally guilt-racked masturbation and emotional conflict, my personality was fucked up. I was permanently twisted emotionally by the fact that I had spent that time, those years, struggling with my own desires. As Wilhelm Reich said, the father of sex-positive psychology, the human species is the only species crazy enough to fight a battle with our own natural impulses, including our own natural biological sex drive, which is built into every single one of us automatically. It's built into every living organism on the planet that reproduces by sex, and that's most of the organisms on the planet. The sex drive is built into it, built into every species, built into the emotional brain of every species, so that we will recognize a sexy situation with members of our own species, and we will feel sexual arousal and sexual desire and have the urge to engage in some kind of sexual play, have the urge to engage in some kind of sexual play with whatever individuals happen to trigger the sexiness recognition centers in our emotional brain and cause us to become emotionally aroused. because when the emotional brain recognizes a sexy source of stimulation of whatever sort, the emotional brain then causes us to become physiologically aroused and emotionally sexually aroused, so that we have the desire to engage in sexual activity, pleasurable sexual activity, preferably in company with whoever it is that has provided the stimulation for us. However, back in 1960, none of the girls of my own age were acting in a sexy enough way to turn on my emotional brain's sexual arousal circuits. Oddly enough, when I was in 8th grade, say 12 years old, 8th grade, and even for a couple of years before that, I had started to have crushes on girls my own age, feeling affection and love for them, and wanting to be with them and wishing they were my girlfriend, never doing anything about it except thinking about it and feeling the floods of euphoria that filled my consciousness whenever I would think of that particular girl that I happened to have a crush on at that particular moment. But I never masturbated thinking about those girls. I was in love with them. But sex was something different. My emotional brain got aroused by media figures like Gina Lollobrigida playing the Queen of Sheba in the movie Solomon and Sheba in very sexy costumes. She was one of the first women who my emotional brain got to see acting in a very sexually provocative way, in a way that was intentionally meant to be sexually provocative, that my emotional brain responded to and started getting aroused by. But of course, I couldn't actually go to Gina Lollobrigida, and say, hey, I would love to do something sexy with you because you're just wonderful. And similarly, then my mother around the house, when she was naked or wearing sexy lingerie or something else, that would turn me on, and I would masturbate thinking about her just as I would masturbate thinking about Gina Lollobrigida, because they were the two sexiest female sexual stimulation sources that my emotional brain had at the time. My emotional brain was getting sexiness, energy from Gina Lollobrigida in the coming attractions of Solomon and Sheba, and then my mom walking around the house semi-naked or naked, or better than naked when she was wearing, some lingerie, but not covering up certain strategic parts of her body. That could be even better than sheer nakedness. And so my emotional brain was responding in the natural way that it was made to. If I'd been living in the Trobriand Islands, instead of Gina Lollobrigida and my mother as my first sex objects, it would have been maybe girls my own age, or actually an older woman who perhaps would be the one to initiate me into sexuality, as in Polynesia, there would be an older woman who would initiate a young boy, and when he was entering puberty, would be one of his older female relatives, the wife of his older brother, or an aunt, or something like this. But then after the initiation with a slightly older woman, or maybe one generation older, then the young man, having learned how to be sexually skillful with his first partner, who had been basically assigned to him, he didn't have to go out and look for her. She was assigned to him by the sex kahuna of his clan, the sex expert of the clan, who gave the boy sexual education and taught him about what you need to do to please a woman and how you can last for a long time and give her several orgasms before you have an orgasm. He would, the sex kahuna would instruct the young boy, who was about 13, in the theory of sex. And then the kahuna would have selected an older female relative of his to actually initiate him in and have practical sex education with her. so that he didn't have to go up through his teenage years wondering whether or not he was going to be an adequate sex partner. He had lessons from an experienced woman who was patient, who would take her time with him, and who would guide him and help him to learn what he needed to do, and so that he became competent. He developed a feeling of competence, a feeling that I can do this well. I can do sex well, and the feeling of competence, being able to do something well, being skillful at that, is one of the key components of self-esteem. And it's a very important part of everyone's self-esteem to be able to feel like, yes, I can do sex well. And I have the experience to know that. I don't have to wonder about that. But in our society, the traditional received sexual prejudices of our society are to try and prevent young people from having sexual experiences at all, if at all possible, prevent them from having sexual experiences. And what that has ended up in is young people experimenting with each other in whatever conditions they can do so outside of the scrutiny of adults. So there is a lot of covert teen sexuality, which is not necessarily very safe sexuality at all. It's kind of a jungle out there, and there will be successes and failures because oftentimes you have inexperienced people trying to have sex with other inexperienced people. So you put two inexperienced people together, it's like taking two people who don't know how to read and asking them to tell each other how to read, asking them to teach each other how to read when neither of them knows how to read. That's what our culture does, because it refuses to accept the fact that human beings, our biological sex drive comes into play at puberty. And from that point on, we are primarily interested in sex for the next 10 years. That's our primary interest. Unless, of course, we've already been given so much sex-negative education before we even reach puberty, and we've been frightened by the sex-phobic adults around us so much that we're scared to have sex, and we feel that it's a bad thing to let ourselves even become sexually aroused. And some people can prevent themselves from ever learning how to become sexually aroused and have orgasms, which is not then the best educational background for later on when you want to get married, when you want to be sexually aroused and have orgasms. If you have suppressed your sex drive entirely up to that point, it may be difficult to learn at that point. Particularly if you've repressed it out of guilt and anxiety, you've developed such a severe inhibition on your sexuality that it's hard to let it come out at all. But of course, the most usual thing is that people do become sexual in their teenage years, primarily by themselves in masturbation, which is the safest way to do it, but also very often in partner sex, which is very often unsafe partner sex in terms of preventing pregnancy and preventing STDs. But at the same time, they feel guilty about it. That is, people are sexually active, they're learning to become sexually aroused and have orgasms, but they're doing so in an emotional state of guilt, or an emotional state of having to repress their guilt, so that half of them is focused on their sexual pleasure and the guilty half is kept out of consciousness, and they have this split in themselves. And after they've had sex, oftentimes the guilt will come back and overwhelm them, and they're in a state of emotional conflict. An emotional conflict creates tension in us, physical tension in us, emotional tension, intellectual tension. Our mind is always racing because our emotions are so filled with anxiety that we're trying to run away from our emotions all the time. And so we have to occupy our mind somehow with doing one thing or another, whether it's playing video games or reading or or doing athletics or whatever it is, but we have to run away from ourselves because we're not comfortable with ourselves. And that was the state I was in, basically. I had a good, strong sex drive because fortunately I learned to develop my sexual response and my orgasmic response before my dad laid the sex guilt trip on me. But then, I had many years throughout my teenage years, I had sexual conflict. I had guilt and anxiety associated with sex, and I had a lot of shame associated with sex. So I was ashamed to ask girls out, for instance. It took me a long time to even start asking girls out. And when I did, it took me a long time to, hold their hand or kiss them or do anything at all. Until finally about my senior year in high school. And I finally had one girlfriend that I'd gone steadily with for about a half a year or a little bit more. And one night we went to see a movie called Lord Love a Duck, where Tuesday Weld, this cute young blonde starlet, this was 1965. She plays this young high school girl who's going out with a college guy, and he wants to make out with her. He wants to pet with her. They're in the front seat of his car, and he wants to put his hand on her breast, and she puts it away, and she pushes his hand away. But then he gives her his fraternity pin so that she can pin on her sweater, meaning like they're going steady. And so then it's okay, and she lets him start caressing her breasts. And although they were completely clothed in his car, that was the first time I'd ever seen a man caressing a woman's breast. And it gave me the idea. I'd never thought about doing that before. And so that night after the movie, when my girlfriend and I were making out together, parked in my car, in the front seat of my car, I started caressing her breasts, and she didn't stop me. And so from then on, after our dates, I would caress her breasts as we made out for hours and hours and hours. And it was about that time that I started masturbating, thinking about her. And then I had a second girlfriend shortly thereafter who not only let me massage her breasts and caress her breasts while we made out, but she let me massage her pussy at the same time, her pubic mound. And she enjoyed that and didn't try to stop me. My previous girlfriend had tried to stop me whenever I tried to touch her pubic mound, which just made me so frustrated that I ended up breaking up with her. But then this other girl was open to pubic mound caressing, and so I started, making out with her for hours and hours, heavy petting. She never touched my penis, and I would go home with a case of massive blue balls, very, painful aching in the testes, which people wonder what that's caused by. And I didn't know what it was caused by either until many years later when I was teaching human sexuality. I was looking at some anatomical drawings, and I realized that there are a certain bunch of muscles under each of the testes, and those muscles can lift the testes up like that. And when we become sexually aroused, those muscles lift up the testes below the erect penis, below the shaft of the erect penis, and hold the testes in close to the erect penis, so that not only is the penis stiff and turgid and taut, but the testes are taut, the balls are taut underneath the penis. And that goes on for as long as the man is sexually aroused. And those muscles are, holding up, and they just get tired, and the blue balls are simply those muscles aching because they've been contracted for so long. They've been contracted in order to hold up the testes. It's not that the testes are so heavy, but the muscles, if you contract muscles for long enough, they start to build up what's known as lactic acid, and they start to get cramps and feel sore and stuff. So the only cure for blue balls, of course, is to go home and masturbate, and then everything relaxes and the pain goes away. And of course, if the woman is compassionate, she would give the young man a hand and help him ejaculate and have an orgasm, even if it's only inside his pants. But at least that would take care of the blue balls. But unfortunately, my girlfriend wasn't that far advanced. She was willing to accept the sexual pleasure of me stroking her body and give me the pleasure of stroking her body, but she wasn't interested in giving me sexual pleasure back in that same way, because she was a Christian, and so she had certain limits on what she would and wouldn't do. And then she went off to college, and I went off to college, and she wrote me a letter, and told me that she was on the pill. She'd gone on the pill in order to help her with menstrual cramps. And, so I thought, well, that was great. Okay, well, gosh, maybe we could even have sex. And then she writes me a letter saying that she has found a place where the two of us, if I came up to visit, the two of us could spend the night together. And so I thought, well, I'm coming next weekend. Definitely let's do this. And I thought that was it. She was going to have sex with me. And so I go up to her campus, which is, a long, well, say a 6-hour journey from where my college was, maybe not that far, but anyway, it was a considerable journey, and spent the weekend up there. And the house she's talking about is a house owned by a professor of hers. And it turns out like there's going to be a whole party of people there that weekend, and a bunch of people are staying over. And so we're just going to be sleeping together in the middle of a living room with a bunch of other people around there. And so there's nothing going to be going on at all, which pissed me off so much that I then broke up with her a couple of months later. I mean, that's just really mean and stupid and such a tease. And, I don't need somebody who's going to treat me like that. But I didn't have that good luck with my girlfriends during those days, even though this was, by this time, this was 1966, 67, and the hippie movement was just getting started. The counterculture had just sort of come into public awareness across the country. And so the sexual revolution was beginning to get underway there. Really, 1968 was, I think, the turning point, and that's when the first movies came out that were R-rated movies, and first time you could see women naked in the movies, at least their breasts and their bottoms, and only for, a moment or two, a couple of seconds or something like that, but that was a big deal in those days. Excuse me. So then I had a girlfriend who was a little more adventurous, a little more advanced, and we ended up a lot of heavy makeout sessions, and we would end up in her dorm room. It was a fairly liberal college that I was at that particular semester, and so young men and women were allowed to visit each other's rooms, and you could close the door and everything. And her roommate was considerate enough to go away and leave us, let us be in there and make out for hours. But what we ended up doing was basically dry humping with our clothes on. I'd be lying on top of her, rubbing my penis against her pubic mound, and we would both ejaculate at the same time. We would both orgasm at the same time. And that was quite satisfying and really great. And this all happened in the last month and a half or so before the end of the semester. And unfortunately, after that, I was going to be going back to California, where I lived. She was in Florida, and she was going up to Virginia to go up to school there, because she was a year or so older than I was, and she was already graduating and was going to go to grad school. But she arranged to come out to California to visit me during the summer, and for a couple of weeks. And so after staying in my hometown for a week or so, then the two of us took off in my car and drove up to the Sierra Nevada mountains and went camping out there. And so we would be out in the pine forest at night in the campground with our sleeping bags next to each other, and we'd unzip the sleeping bags and start fondling each other. And that was the first time that I ever had my hand actually on a naked female pussy mound and vagina and vaginal lips, and felt the inside of her vagina, which I thought, wow, nothing that I know of feels like this. The only other thing that would feel like it would be the inside of one's mouth, but we don't usually stick our fingers in our mouth and feel the inside of our cheeks, but it would be about the same kind of sensation. But anyway, so she was, willing to let me do that. We were, very hot and heavy there in that respect, although once again, I don't think she was, I don't remember her touching my penis at all. She was just letting me caress her, and she would have an orgasm when I caressed her naked vagina. And so I thought that was making some progress there, getting quite a bit more intimate. And then just before we were to come back again, and she was going to have to leave, the last night of our road trip, we stayed overnight in my aunt and uncle's house, which was a real big house, and there was nobody else there. I don't know where they went, where the whole family was gone somewhere, but I somehow had a key to get in, and so she and I could stay there that night. And so we went into one of the bedrooms downstairs, kind of a vacant bedroom where there was kind of a mattress in there or whatever. I suppose we stretched out our sleeping bags on the mattress or something like that. For the first time, she got completely naked with me. We got completely naked together. And I realized that she was going to be willing to have sex with me, finally, on this last night of our trip. But it took me completely by surprise. And I didn't have a chance to get a condom because I didn't know this was going to happen. And even if I had, back in the 60s, people really didn't talk about using the condom for birth control. They just talked about using the pill. And if a woman wasn't on the pill, then, she was likely to get pregnant. And I knew that my girlfriend was not on the pill. So it was this spontaneous decision, this passionate decision on our last night together. Let's have something to remember, and we'll have a great time together. But I knew she wasn't using the pill, and I didn't have a condom. And so I had to make a choice. Was I gonna have sex for the first time in my life that I've been waiting for years? By this time, I'm 20 years old, I think she's 21, 22. And am I finally going to be able to have sex? And I was really hard and ready to go. I was lying naked on top of her, and my penis was erect, and she had her legs spread, and my penis was actually right there at the entrance to her vagina. And all I would have had to do would have been to slide it inside. And I thought, if she gets pregnant, I'm going to have to marry her. And that's going to change my entire life. Because that's what you did back in those days, was if a girl got pregnant, you basically had to marry her. And, she was going to be in a graduate program, and it would mess up her graduate program if she got pregnant, and maybe had to drop out or something. And I would have to be tied down. And I wasn't willing to be tied down at the age of 20 to any kind of commitment like that. I had been tied down until about a year earlier by another very strong commitment, which was the United States fucking government with their goddamn fucking draft that wanted to send me off to Vietnam to go get killed in Southeast Asia and go kill people that I never had laid my eyes on and had no quarrel with whatsoever. And the government, was giving me a choice. Either stay in school and keep your student deferment, or get drafted and go to Vietnam. And I was so ready to not be in school. By the time I had finished high school and started college, I'd been in school my entire life. I wanted to do something besides school. I was sure that there was more to life than school. And I hated the fact that the government was blackmailing me into staying in school by threatening to send me to Vietnam if I didn't do that. And I have always hated blackmail. I would gladly murder anyone who tried to blackmail me in any way, shape, or form, try and coerce me. Fuck them is my attitude, and that was my attitude toward the government. And so I said, well, fuck you, I'm not going to stay in school. I'm going to drop out of school, I'm going to get a job, and if you try to draft me, I'm going to go to Europe and go to Sweden and stay over there and live there instead. But at least I'll live free rather than being, under the thumb of the government. I had never agreed to go to Vietnam. I'd never agreed to go into the army. All of a sudden they told me, at age 17, well, as soon as you turn 18, we own you. We own you. We own you for 2 years. And we can do anything we want with you. You're our slave for 2 years. We can send you to go get killed, send you to go kill other people. I never fucking signed up for that, I'll tell you. So I dropped out of school, went to work, and sure enough, sooner or later, a few months later, they classified me 1A. I submitted my conscientious objector form, saying that I believed that the worst thing that any human being can do to another is to kill them. And so it's against my conscientious beliefs to go to a war and go kill somebody. But they turned down my application because it wasn't based on religion. It was just based on my own feelings about what's right and wrong. If I had been able to say, well, I'm a Quaker, and we Quakers don't go to war because an invisible imaginary being up there told us it's wrong, then I'd have gotten out of it. If I could have pled, an imaginary being has told me that war is wrong. If I'd been delusional, I could have gotten out of the draft. But I wasn't willing to plead, religious delusion. It was no. I just personally, my own conscience tells me that this would be the wrong thing to do. I have no quarrel with those people in Vietnam whatsoever. And you've got no right to take me and try and force me to commit murder in Vietnam. I won't do it. But anyway, they turned down my application. And so then a psychotherapist that I was seeing at the time said, well, listen, you should do what I did, which is when you choose your specialty, when you go enlist, instead of being drafted, don't let yourself be drafted, go enlist for 3 years instead of being drafted for 2 years. And by enlisting for 3 years, you get to choose your specialty and choose language. He said, I chose Spanish language, and I ended up just teaching language at the Monterey's language school for the armed services. So do that instead. So I foolishly took his advice and went to the recruiting office and took the tests, and came back with great scores on the tests. And so I could choose my specialty. What did I want to choose? So I chose the language specialty to learn Serbo-Croatian, the language that they speak in Yugoslavia, because at that time the United States was having nothing to do with Yugoslavia. We had no quarrels with Yugoslavia, and the worst that could happen to me would be I'd be sent to Italy or someplace in order to listen in on radio transmissions in Serbo-Croatian or something like that. So I figured that would be all right. It wouldn't be contributing to the Vietnam War effort. But I was so fucking naive. They said, yeah, you get to choose your specialty, you get to choose your training. But what they don't tell you is that when you finish that training, they don't have to assign you to the specialty that you did your training in. They could say, oh, All right, great. You learned Serbo-Croatian. Very well. You were the best Serbo-Croatian student in the class, but guess what? We don't need anybody to speak Serbo-Croatian right now, but we need a lot of people to speak Vietnamese. So we're going to have you learn Vietnamese, and once you learn that, then we'll assign you the specialty of speaking Vietnamese in Vietnam. You see, that was the deceptive bait and switch game that the Army enlistment was doing at that time. But I didn't know that. However, I ended up going down to take my physical, my enlistment physical, and it turned out at that time I wore glasses, extremely thick glasses, because I was very nearsighted. When I would hold my hand there, it was in focus, but if I moved it out to there, it went out of focus, and it went progressively out of focus from there. So I could see from my nose out to 4 inches without my glasses. And so when I was taking the draft physical and they measured my glasses and they saw how strong they were, they said, oh, you get classified 1Y. I'd never heard of the 1Y classification. I'd heard of 4F, and I thought you either had to have 4F or you were in. But no, there's 1Y, which is like you're so physically unfit that we're not going to assign you to active duty. We're just going to put you on reserve, and only if there's a national crisis will we call you up at that point and send you into the Army. So basically it was like getting out of the draft. And that had happened about a year earlier. And the feeling of liberation that I had when I realized finally my life belonged to me. It didn't belong to the fucking government. It didn't belong to my parents. It just belonged to me. I could decide what I wanted to do with my life from now on. The enlistment physical was in downtown Los Angeles, and then up the street was Los Angeles City Hall, a number of blocks away, which was where I could go to get my passport to go to Europe. And so when I left the draft physical, I went skipping down the street, literally skipping down the street, singing at the top of my lungs, I'm back on the street again, back on my own 2 feet again, which was one of the popular rock songs of the day. I sang that at the top of my lungs, skipping all the way down the street to the city hall, and went and got my passport and went to Europe for 8 weeks with my younger brother. We had a great time. And then I was able to come back and do whatever I wanted. And so I went back to school, going to a school in Florida, because when my brother and I were in Paris, we had met a guy from that school in Florida. He said, that's where you ought to go, because it's more for unconventional people, sort of like you. And so I went there, and that's where I met the girl, whom I am then, the following summer, in my aunt and uncle's house, in the bedroom down in the basement, on the mattress, on the sleeping bag, both of us naked, with my penis poised at the entrance to her vagina, thinking, do I want to give up my freedom now? Do I even want to take a chance with losing my freedom permanently, now that I've been free for just 1 year? And the answer was no and hell no. Sorry, as much as I would love to have my first sexual experience right now, I am not willing to gamble the freedom of for the rest of my life on that one sexual experience. And I'm so glad that I made that decision. Boy. So she went back east to Virginia. What I did instead was I just did exactly what I had visualized doing with my mom in my earliest masturbation fantasies, which was rubbing my naked penis on her pubic mound and her pubic hair and ejaculating onto her tummy. And so that's exactly what I did with my girlfriend, and the whole experience was over in 10 seconds. And I had no consequences from it after that. She tried to scare me after school, after we'd been back in school for a month or so. She wrote me a letter saying that she'd missed her period, and making me think, what if she was pregnant? and I should volunteer to marry her. That's what she wanted me to write back was, well, if you are pregnant, I'll marry you. And I said, no, I didn't put that thing in there. Okay, some people, there was this rumor going around that, a drop of semen on the outside of a girl's thigh, on the inside of her thigh, let's say outside of the vagina, the semen could wriggle its way across the skin and up into the vagina and up into the fallopian tubes and impregnate an egg up there somewhere. So, I thought it was a real possibility, so it scared the shit out of me for several weeks. And I was just so pissed at her about that whole thing, particularly when she wrote back finally after a while. And she said, I didn't answer that letter at all. I didn't say a thing. And then finally she writes me another letter saying, oh, well, I got my period after all. No problem. You shouldn't have worried at all. Yeah, like I'd spent 2 or 3 of the worst weeks of my life, thanks to her. And so, I broke up with her at that point. I said, forget it, I'm not going to have anything more to do with a woman like that who will do that to me. So I maintained my independence, but then for the next few years, I didn't really connect with anybody and have a girlfriend at all for the next few years. I was pursuing various women, who were around, but none of them really seemed to be interested in me, and so I was without a girlfriend for several years. And then I read Wilhelm Reich when I was going through a really suicidal period. I had sort of flunked out of school because I had tried to take 3 history classes in a single quarter. And I'd never been on the quarter system before, and I didn't realize how fast it went by and how many books there were to read for each of the classes, and 2 major papers to write, one of them on Karl Marx, and was there a difference between the mature Karl Marx and the young Karl Marx? And in order to answer that question, I'd have had to read Das Kapital, which I didn't have time to do in a 9-week quarter system. And then the other class was in intellectual history of modern Europe, and the teacher had given us a topic for the paper which was so abstract and so confusing that there was only one person in the whole class who understood what the question even meant, and that was the graduate student. And I think he was just kissing the professor's ass, pretend saying, oh yeah, I know what it means, and the rest of it didn't have a clue what the paper was supposed to be about. And so I just gave up. I said, I can't possibly do this. So I dropped out of school, and I was suicidal. I thought I'd just fuck myself up forever, and I shouldn't even go on living. But then one night I had a dream of Janis Joplin, who had died not too long before that, of an overdose or alcohol and drugs of something. And so she was dead, but then they issued her posthumous record called Pearl, and my roommate had bought that, and so we'd been playing that record constantly in the apartment. And so one night when I was in my very suicidal, depressed stage, I had a dream of Janis Joplin singing at a concert, and I was in the audience of the concert. And then all of a sudden I was in the front row of the audience, standing there looking up at Janis singing on the stage, and she was singing directly to me, and she was saying, love yourself, accept yourself, however you are. No matter what bad stuff has happened to you, no matter how much you failed, just love yourself and keep on going, was the basic message of that dream. So my unconscious was using Janis Joplin to tell me, don't give up, Steve, just keep on going. So I did. I said, okay, I am going to quit trying to be the most brilliant academic student ever. I'm going to just take the easiest course I possibly can. I actually tried to get into the School of Creative Studies. I was going to try and become a music composer. I loved to write folk songs and that kind of stuff. But they weren't accepting any students So instead, I ended up going up to the Central Valley of California to a little college, a state college that nobody's ever heard of. You know, it only costs like $90 a semester tuition, you know, and living was very cheap there, and my mom was going to pay for it because she'd rather I did that. She was just trying to get me to graduate from college, so, and it wasn't very much that she had to pay, and so she was supporting me in that school, and I said, I'm just going to take theater arts because I love drama, I love being in plays, and there won't be any homework. I won't have to write any papers probably, and it'll just be for fun, and I'll be able to just kick back and have a good time. And at the same time, I had come across the writings of Wilhelm Reich, the father of sex-positive psychology, who said, you know, the sex drive is a natural biological drive, and it's healthy for us, and we need to satisfy that sex drive with an orgasm on a regular basis, or we're not going to be healthy and happy. And so that was when I got a sex-positive attitude, and I quit feeling embarrassed about masturbation or ashamed of masturbation at all. And when I went up to this little college in the Central Valley, for the first time ever, I had a room all to myself. I had a little studio apartment with a little kitchenette, you know, a bathroom, and a bedroom with big windows at the end that looked out into the courtyard, and there was a swimming pool there, and there was a sauna there. This was a brand new apartment complex that had just been built, and yet the rents were incredibly cheap because this little school that nobody's ever heard of, they couldn't get enough students to come there because it was way out in the boonies. And so there weren't enough students to fill up the apartment complex, so the rents were really cheap. And so my mom didn't mind getting me a studio apartment. What a luxury. First time I had a place all to myself. I could masturbate any time of the day or night, as often as I wanted, as long as I wanted, without having to worry about anybody walking in on me, nobody knocking on the door. I didn't know anybody up there at the time. And so that was fantastic. I slept naked for the first time. I quit wearing pajamas, slept naked, and when I got up in the morning, that big plate glass window, I had the curtains drawn, but I got up in the morning, had my little portable stereo, and I had the 2 record set of Joe Cocker's live concert at the Fillmore East in New York that he did with Leon Russell on piano and a whole bunch of great artists and backup singers, a whole choir, and like horns and everything. The most rockin' live concert that I had ever seen. Joe Cocker's Mad Dogs and Englishmen. And, you know, he played a lot of Rolling Stones songs, and he sang gospel songs, did all kinds of stuff. It was just great. So, in order to get going every day, I didn't have any classes until 10 o'clock in the morning, so that was cool. I didn't have to wake up at the crack of dawn. I could, you know, wake up at a reasonable hour, get out of bed, and dance naked in the room to Joe Cocker and his whole band, and do that 2 sides of the record if I want. As long as I want to just dancing naked, shaking my penis around, just being as wild and crazy as I wanted to be. And then when it was time to go to class at 10 o'clock, all I had to do was, you know, put on some clothes and literally walk across the street, because the theater building was the closest building on campus to the apartment complex. Right across the street, and I'm in class. And then after class, I decided to get into the physical. I'd been such an intellectual person, but now after reading Wilhelm Reich and understanding how important our body is and how important it is to have the energy flowing through our body, I decided to be physical. So I would run around the campus, and then I would come back to the apartment complex, and I would go swimming in the swimming pool. And then I would get out and sit in the sauna and get all relaxed in the heat of the sauna. And when the sauna was too hot, I'd get out and swim in the swimming pool again, and then get back in the sauna, and then swim in the swimming pool, and then go up to my bedroom. And I would be so relaxed. My whole body would feel so good from all that physical exercise and from the relaxation of the sauna that I would sleep like a log. It was wonderful. I felt so good and so relaxed. And then get up in the morning naked and dance naked to Joe Cocker around the room, and get myself going. It was a wonderful semester, and no pressure on me, academically. And that was where I met the young woman in my acting class. She and I were assigned to do a scene together in which we got to kiss each other. So it was fun to rehearse the scene. And at one point, she's the one who said to me, "Are you going to go to the Pinecrest drama workshop this summer?" And I said, "I have no idea what that is." And she said, "Oh, you should go to it. It's really cheap. It's like $200 for 8 weeks. And that includes room and board, everything. And no tuition, because it was being put on by a community college, the community college from the little town of Sonora, California. And what they did was they rented a little conference center up in the pine forests near Pinecrest Lake up in the Sierras. And so we had acting classes all that summer. And that was where I learned my first pleasurology exercises, muscle loosening up exercises. And after doing those week after week, my emotional mood started to improve so much that it really was a turning point in my emotional life. And I've been doing that kind of muscle relaxing exercises every day for the rest of my life since then. And that's been 53 years. That was 1972, and I'm recording this in 2025. So 53 years, boy, that changed my life. What a great, great thing. And then after, and I would have liked to have gotten laid up there, but after reading Wilhelm Reich, I was really in the frame of mind that, okay, I'm ready to have intercourse now, and hopefully most of the girls now will be on the pill, because this was now 1972. See, with the previous girlfriend, that was the summer of 1969, and so there was those 3 years, 1970, 71, 72, big change. A lot more of the girls were using contraceptives, but even though I had a girlfriend at the Pinecrest drama workshop, and we used to sleep together outside under the pine trees, and she was as sweet as could be. I loved that little girl, beautiful girl. We didn't have sex. I don't think she was on the pill, and she wasn't ready to have sex. And then after that, I ended up in England on a theater in England class that was only like a total of about 3 weeks over there. And it was a class that my mother had signed up to be part of. She was going to go on that class, but then she decided that she couldn't do it emotionally because she was recently widowed, and she would have felt too bad going there and missing her dead husband, whom she'd only been married to for about 3 years before he died of cancer, pancreatic cancer. So she had thought that she would be emotionally ready to do this, and she paid for it and everything. And then she realized she didn't want to go on it because it would be too sad to do it without her dead husband. And so she said, "Steve, you go instead." So I did. And that was where I finally had the chance to have sexual intercourse for the first time with a girl who was on the pill. And I will tell you next time how that turned out.